the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will consider and analyse the most significant global issues that have defined 2021. The topics will include, but will not be exclusive to, leadership, and we'll look at Trump, Putin, Xi, Biden, and the rise of authoritarianism in 2021. The pandemic, we'll look at that too, especially the impact that COVID-19 and its variants have had on global security and security itself. We will discuss Afghanistan, AUKUS, autonomous weapons, cyber hackers, cyber attackers, and all that comes with this new technology warfare or weaponry. And what can we expect in 2022? We'll talk to Paul about what he sees are the trends that have established and will continue on into the next year. But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you are joining us live, we can include your comments in this program, so do feel free to do so. Let's cross to Paul, who's waiting online to discuss these issues. And good afternoon, Paul.
Bom dia, Mestre Selwyn. Tudo bem com você? I figure since we're doing a global roundup, I practice my Portuguese on you,
and lose me in the case of it.
It was all good. Now it's basically good day, Master Selwyn, or is everything good with you? And I assume it is.
Yeah, it's ka pai, Paul, and I should say, and I should have greeted you in a language back, shouldn't I? You know, I should have said tēnā koe mātua e hoa.
There you go. Well, I'm learning from you. I'm learning from you and from the 8-year-old in this house. So
your
we're making
son,
progress.
Yeah, good old Ender. Well, this is the last program that we are going to be doing in 2021, so I'm kind of looking forward to going through this one, Paul, and just picking up those trends and what the big issues were. We've outlined some of them in the introduction there, but I'll hand it over to you. What are the big ones that you would want to lead off with in this episode of A View from Afar?
Okay, well, I think I'll start with the macro level, the big trends, and then we can dissect them as we go along in the show. For me, basically, there are two long shadows being cast over world affairs these days. One is terminally dark, and that is the rise of authoritarianism in the last 5 to 6 years. 10 years ago, more than 2/3 of the world were led by democratic regimes, some of them fragile, some of them mature, some of them liberal, some of them not so liberal, but democratic, at their core. Today, that's been reversed. More than 2/3 of the world's governments are authoritarian. The difference from old dictatorships is that these authoritarians get elected into power, then they close down the shop. They remove press freedoms, they stack the judiciary with their cronies, they do that sort of thing. We're in an age of authoritarianism, and we're early days. This is going to get worse before it abates. I tend to believe in cyclical tides of political change, and so eventually there will be a backlash to authoritarians. But right now, authoritarianism is the name of the game, and there are two aspects to this that I think are important to note. The first one is that democracies are under siege from without, be it the PRC influence campaigns, be it Russian disinformation. Authoritarians are emboldened because they now have direct influence methodologies where they can impact on the internal politics of democracies in a way that they couldn't before. And some of these authoritarian regimes, again, the Chinese foremost amongst them, can use dollar diplomacy and increasingly debt diplomacy in order to exert their will in foreign affairs. I just read that the main airport in Uganda could not pay its debts to the Chinese who built it So ownership of that airport has just been turned over to the Chinese Airport Authority. They now own that airport outright. So that's the external side. The internal side is the fault of democracy itself. Let's be very honest, and you and I have talked about this. If you look around the world of liberal democracy, say in France, say in the UK, Australia, quite frankly, with the exception of New Zealand, and then my favorite, Uruguay, democracies are rotting from within. They are corrupt. The influence of corporate money and lobbying is now pervasive. Even Canada has got serious issues along those lines, and the Canadians have traditionally been paragons of virtue when it comes to, democratic sentiment. So the fault of the backsliding of democracy, as it's known, is not just because there are hostile authoritarian actors. It's our own fault. Now, we're lucky. We live in New Zealand, which is a fairly progressive liberal democracy that's doing very well. But as last week's show pointed out, we're now starting to feel the impact of these pernicious influences at home. So even we're not immune from it. And I'm worried about that, of course, as last week's show noted in some detail.
We dedicated the whole program to it, didn't we?
I'm worried, to be honest with you. To me, that's the biggest national security threat that New Zealand has, is the erosion of faith in democracy and support for democracy amongst the citizenry. Now,
so just on that, as countries like New Zealand, are they the ones you believe are under threat in the slide toward authoritarianism, or are they going to be lost in the wake of other countries that are more likely to shift their style of governance in that direction?
I think it's more the latter than the former. I mean, that's an excellent question. I think we're not under siege yet here in New Zealand. And again, I draw parallels with Uruguay because they're a liberal democracy of about 5 million people, agrarian based. They're run by a right-center government, but they're more or less in a position like we are. They've done well with pandemic mitigation. Their economy hasn't suffered because of the pandemic, in part because of mitigation. So there's something about these small democracies that, to their credit, has allowed them to withstand the pressures that are occurring elsewhere. And those pressures elsewhere tend to spill out into world affairs, and that's where we see direct influence coming in. However, if large power liberal democracies, let's say the United States, UK, Australia, perhaps the Germans, they start to harden, if they start to develop, well, certainly if national populist sentiment begins to creep into governance, then we're going to have problems with our allies because they will want us to go along. They will want us to heel to their directives. And I don't think we should do it. And quite frankly, if we did do it, we'd be compromising our own value system. So that's on the horizon, to be sure.
And some parts of the world are confronting exactly what you're describing that the South Pacific may have to confront in the near future. Some regions are already doing that, aren't they? Like if we look at the EU, for example, here's something that Deutsche Welle was reporting on just overnight, really. And this is the rise of authoritarianism, not just in the core of the Russian Federation, with Putinism, but spreading, Belarus, and other former Soviet satellite states starting to do this. And I'll just play this clip here, Paul, if we can, and just pick
Russia
up that
says
audio.
it's entitled to station its troops on its territory and insists they pose no threat. But NATO and Ukraine say Moscow may be preparing to launch an attack.
The meeting of NATO's top diplomatic ministers comes at a tense time. They have pledged their support to Ukraine and are calling on Russia to stand down.
We stand united in our aim to deter Russia from any further aggressive actions. We call on Russia to be transparent, de-escalate and reduce tensions. Any future Russian aggression against Ukraine would come at a high price.
Now, Paul, we've heard and we've dedicated programs to this very issue. We've heard a lot about this with Russia coming on board.
Russian troops seen massing near the Ukraine border in early November. The build-up sparked fears of a possible invasion. Ukraine responded with its own show of force, military exercises in the border region.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring some of the realities of what we've seen in the last 2 weeks. It's not looking retrospectively back to a year ago. This is intensifying once again in those areas. So this is, in a nutshell, what we're talking about here: the rise of authoritarianism, the sustaining of authoritarianism, the spread of authoritarianism in significant regions around the globe. You've made mention to it of the authoritarian kind of styles that differ from the point of view of, if you looked at the People's Republic of China and you compared to Trumpism, there are commonalities, but there are different ways of expressing this, isn't it? So what do you see, if we start talking about the different flavours that are coming out through the various authoritarian leaders, for example, Vladimir Putin. If we look at Trumpism itself, we dedicated the program on it, so we might just touch on that because of last week's issues. But Xi himself. So where do you see the shifting? And also, do leaders like Biden, do they have to pick up that kind of tough guy, the big lapel type of stance in these global forums to basically get their message and their will accepted and heard in a degree of momentum to it?
Yeah, well, to the specifics of the Russian massing on the border, that's a straight geopolitical issue. What the Russians want to do is Finlandize their Western Front. That is to say, create a buffer zone of neutral states, Ukraine being foremost amongst them, in the way that Finland was used during the Cold War, where it was not a member of NATO. It was basically controlled by the Soviet Union, but without public mention of the fact, and they remained assiduously neutral in all the quarrels of the Cold War. Well, if the Russians can Finlandize the Ukraine, they already had Belarus. If they can make movement along those lines in Latvia, Estonia, other frontline states, then they certainly will have achieved their objective, not only creating this extra buffer zone along their Western Front, but also undermining democracy in the places that are. Belarus is not, but Estonia and Latvia are actually, fairly thriving democracies, and they're under siege. So that's a straight geopolitical ploy. The bigger issue, and I mean, again, we have to circle back to, the problems of democracy. You and I have talked about this at great length, but not a lot of people read about democracy the way we do. A lot of the citizens of mature democratic regimes, the United States, for example, is 250 years into its democratic experiment, and look how that's going.
Yeah.
They no longer see democracy for its intrinsic worth. What they see is, does it deliver on its promises? Does it deliver me economic opportunity? Does it deliver me complete equality of political choice? And let's be honest, it does not. Democracy in its current phase, even in the most liberal of countries, such as New Zealand, I won't say the deck is stacked, but if you're rich, your opportunities are more. You're not guaranteed economic opportunity by virtue of the fact that you have democratic governance. And a lot of people have failed to understand that democracy is a facilitator of other things because of the freedoms inherent in it, but it is not a direct provider of things like economic advancement. That occurs through the capitalist system, which is mitigated by democratic governance. Well, if you have the corrupt effects of lobbying, corporate lobbying, and that sort, people lose faith in the system. And that's where, it's the old joke about Mussolini being able to make the trains run on time. Yeah. The democracy that preceded Mussolini was chaotic. Governments were rising and falling. He came into power as the leader of a minority faction and then used parliamentary rules to usurp the government of the day. So he used democracy and then imposed fascism on Italy. But he was supported, and the reason for that was people were fed up with the quarreling of the democratic leadership of the time, just the way, for example, people are fed up with the quarreling between Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress. And so they'll take a strong leader. I grew up in Latin America. I lived under many dictatorships. The amount of times people told me, look, at democracy sounds great in the Anglo-Saxon world, but what we need here is a strong man to impose a coherent vision of what the nation is and what its future will be.
Of course, it didn't turn out well, and that example did it for many, many hundreds of thousands of people, nor the economies of Chile and Argentina, for example.
Yeah, no. Dictatorship is not a solution to democratic failure. But unfortunately, there are many people. But that's me, the academic, talking. Most people, don't get PhDs in political science to talk about democratic theory. And so for the man on the street, but also for the military man, for the business man or woman, they look at the chaos of democracy. Argentina is a good case in point now. They say, look, we got to get rid of these guys and get someone who can give us certainty, who can give us some predictability in policy making. That is the inherent cause of democratic demise, not Chinese influence operations, not Russian disinformation. Those things wouldn't work if democracy wasn't already deeply flawed and fractured. So, what I would simply say is that geopolitical ploys are taking advantage of this, but the democratic world needs to put its house in order. I would make defensive liberal democracy a core national security value. Even though I'm a realist, I would simply say from liberal democracy, all good things flow, because it gives you it just gives you the freedoms to pursue things in a relatively unfettered way. We just need to check some of the excesses that have occurred over the last 30 some odd years under neoliberalism. I will pin some blame on neoliberalism for the rotting out or hollowing out of democracy. But we need to get our house in order. And I'll tell you what, Selwyn, Biden's about to hold some sort of summit of democracies in which, among other things, he's invited President Erdogan of Turkey, who is,
what's that about? I mean,
Yeah,
I've got a lot of respect for the Turkish people. Some of the philosophies that came out of Turkey around World War I and onwards, for example, with Ataturk and others, but the current leadership doesn't kind of connect to that, does it?
No, and I don't think holding summits at the leadership level with people who are clearly not democratic. I think I don't think that solves anything. I think Biden's ploy is that if you get quasi-democrats, I'm being generous here, like Erdogan or Viktor Orban of Hungary, and you invite them in, somehow you're going to stave off the influence of other authoritarian regimes like the Chinese.
That makes sense and Russia, of course, because if you hark back to the invasion of Iraq, Turkey was one of those regional players of where the United States military hardware could gather in mass and use as a stepping stone to the whatever operations they were conducting in Iraq, wasn't it? So, and then you saw with the conflicts in Syria and under Erdogan, you saw changes there where it wasn't so appeasing to the United States' interests, certainly under Trump's tenure. So it may be a little bit of getting them back, getting them talking, getting them amongst their former allies and see where they go with that. We get that, but at the same time, this is a leader of which, was bruised and retaliated in an authoritarian form from an attempted coup that occurred only a matter of years ago, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that horse has bolted with some of these leaders. And the only hope is that the Turkish people will in future circumstances, elect someone who's genuinely democratic. I mean, think of it this way. Turkey had tactical nukes, U.S. tactical nukes on its soil throughout the Cold War. caused a mini crisis with the Russians that precipitated, as it turns out, the Cuban Missile Crisis. They had those tactical nukes up until very recently. Can you imagine the U.S. having nuclear weapons on Turkish soil under Erdogan today?
Yeah. Look, I've been there during Turkey's National Day where it rolls out, you know, it's military hardware, most of it American-made, and American-designed at the very least. And it is a powerful thing. It's like France or Paris on Bastille Day. And, you know, when that apparatus, where that military presence is in the hands of a person that you wouldn't want to share your Christmas dinner with, then you start to have some questions around whether or not that particular expression of government in that country is actually worthwhile sustaining from the point of view of putting your military best in its hands. That was always an issue of concern to me when I saw the leadership changing hands in the years that ticked on just after that. Paul, if we're getting back, if we look at, you know, President Xi, now we know that it has been formalised now within the CCP. Can you just speak to us a little bit about that and what it may mean with respect to, one, People's Republic of China, but also its footprint around the world? I'll just tag on there too. It seems like, sorry, just to divert, but very quickly, China seems to have eased back its presence in global discussions and dialogue and news in the last week or so. And I noticed what it's been pushing this week is 1 billion vaccinations being provided to Africa for the COVID pandemic, and that might just segue a little bit into our next topic. But you know, there's been a change since the bilateral meeting with Joe Biden and President Xi, People's Republic of China's leader, only a matter of weeks ago.
Well, I tend to swim against the tide on issues with China because I see a lot of problems for President Xi's leadership. He's decided to go full Mao on his country, on his regime. To include now, there is the little book of Chairman Xi's writings that's distributed and is mandatory reading in public schools, all schools. Here's what strikes me. The Chinese have not been quiet during the pandemic in international affairs. They've pulled back a little bit where they felt overextended. But when it comes, for example, to the ongoing conflicts in the South China Sea, they've increased their presence. You know, pandemic notwithstanding, their Navy is increasing. We've seen, of course, you know, their military maneuvering on their western borders. You know, the clashes with the Indians continue, albeit small scale. But here's what I think is very interesting, and it's a story that's come up in the news that is, for me, is really incongruous. So the story is this, you know, we know about the, if it's not genocide, it's pretty darn close to it, of the Uyghurs. It's definitely cultural genocide. So we know these big crimes. But here's where I see the Achilles heel of this regime starting to emerge. There's this Chinese tennis player, female tennis player. A few weeks back, she denounces the number 3 guy in the Communist Party because he sexually assaulted her. He coerced her into having sex. She's the most famous Chinese tennis player. I can't remember her name, but she's in the top 10 in the world, that sort of thing. So she goes on social media and denounces this guy by name and says that he's been sexually preying on me since I was a teenager. She's now in her mid-20s. She disappears. You know, within days of her doing that, she disappears. Now remember Jack Yang, the head of Alibaba. He made some critical commentary of the CCP and he disappeared for
Jack
9
Ma.
months.
Yeah,
Jack Ma, sorry.
Yeah,
and when he came out, he was very mellow, very mellow. So she disappears. The Women's Tennis Association complains, and they put some sort of staged photo op of this tennis player that could have been filmed anytime. And then they stage a conversation with the head of the International Olympic Committee, who is as corrupt as the day is long. And the IOC is about to host the Winter Games in China. So they go with a lackey to show that she's supposedly alive. Well, here's the thing, Selwyn. The bigger picture is this. The party matters more than the individual. If a famous tennis player denounces a guy who's number 3 in the party because he couldn't control his impulses, he needs to go. You just remove him, put him in retirement and proceed on. Instead, they disappear her. They're not seeing the forest for the trees here. You don't defend, one of the apparatchiks when it could bring down your whole system of rule. Because this, alerts the public in general. The Chinese public are aware of this, that something's rotten in the CCP. So the fact that they turned on her, all the human rights issues and sexual rights issues involved in that notwithstanding, is an error in judgment. It's a gross error in judgment.
And you don't have to look too far back in history to Romania, for example, for the Ceausescu moment at Suniswara, with respect to that, where the population starts to just make rumbles and noises shakes the authoritarianism out of its suit, if you like. The other thing is what's interesting here too, I think, is the advancement of announcements coming out of, and I mentioned it just before, out of China with respect to providing Africa with vaccinations, 1 billion of which it's saying it will ship and export across to the continent to address its pandemic needs. Now that I think is fabulous. That is philanthropic. But also, capacity building and doing the right thing on a humanitarian scale. But are we seeing this used as a new form of checkbook diplomacy? And if we are, is that a bad thing?
Well, obviously it is. I mean, it's clear. It's called COVID diplomacy. And what you do is you provide vaccinations in exchange for future favors. Now, the West is to blame for all this because vaccination hoarding in the developed world is precisely the reason why
IPs, etc.
This new variant has now taken hold first in Africa. So the West has nothing but to blame itself for this. The Chinese are taking advantage of it. Plus, it provides a very good diversion from the very domestic issues that I've just alluded to. And one last thing about that. The number 3 guy, the number 2 guy, and the Chinese Communist Party are all personal loyalists of Xi Jinping. The personalization of an institutionalized party like the Chinese Communist Party is a bad sign for them. Again, the nation rules over the regime rules over the party rules over the individual. Individuals do not matter in a large setup like that. And the personalization of the leadership around the figure of Xi Jinping is trouble for them. And so I actually see that they're doing a lot of their moves on the international scene to divert away from what may well be, I don't know for a fact, I'm not a sinologist, I'm not a Chinese expert, but I think there's some rumbling out there, and they're trying to quash it early, in part by doing these diversionary maneuvers. The important thing, and I've said this to people in the New Zealand security community, is we, again, as a progressive liberal democracy, we want to introduce into our security paradigms things like, climate change, pandemic mitigation, what has been for the last 50 years known as non-traditional security concerns, but they're clearly at the fore. What I've tried to say to people in the New Zealand security community is that's all fine and dandy. To be a bad guy, I'll say it's rather woke of you. But the fact is there are people out there who don't admit climate change, who don't care about the pandemic. And these people are authoritarians in very powerful countries. And so we may want to change our paradigms, and in some measure, it may help us in small ways, but if certain big players place as a secondary concern pandemic mitigation and climate change concerns in favor of traditional security concerns like great power rivalry, nuclear weapons, that sort of thing, then nothing we do as a small democratic state is going to change the overall state of affairs.
The way you've explained that, it seems to be two things there. If you put them on a pair of scales and you look at one, you've got issues relating to security, defence, foreign policy that is a response or advancement from the point of view of intergovernment kind of relationships or breakdown of relationships, the crisis elements, the human elements of crisis. And then you've got the other part of security that may be undermined by the forces of nature that are in existence around the planet, and certainly New Zealand is on the Pacific Rim of Fire, and climate change is lapping at our things. We've got responsibilities in the Pacific to those that are worse off and are struggling to establish adaptation that will deliver some sort of sustainability relating to their existence in their traditional land. So, it seems to me there are two things there. Are governments like New Zealand trying to meld the two into one, or one becomes dominant? If it becomes dominant from the point of view of climate change, mitigation, et cetera, what is that doing? Is that saying New Zealand is regressing back from its traditional defence policies into one of response to disaster and nothing else? So it becomes isolationist and independent, totally independent from perhaps blue helmet exercises around the world, which is where perhaps Labor governments of the past have positioned our foreign policy, defence policy.
I find that some of the recent discussions are a reinvention of the wheel. I'll point out, when I worked in the Pentagon, I was part of a futures forecasting group, where we looked over the horizon threats of all sorts. It was a very cool group to work with. And among those threats, we had the threat of resource wars. And the resource wars were going to be wars over potable water, clean water. And Southeast Asia in particular was an area of concern because the Chinese were siphoning the Mekong Delta. They were taking water from their neighboring countries. Water was becoming scarce, clean, fresh water. And lo and behold, 30 years later, we're now seeing the beginning of these resource conflicts. They're not full-fledged wars. Another one was the humanitarian concerns of climate change, because we now have climate refugees in the South Pacific, and New Zealand's been a recipient of those refugees. All of this was predictable 30 years ago, but quite frankly, when that was laid out to the policymakers in Washington in the mid-90s, when I was working there, they were basically ignored in favor of traditional security threats.
I'll just add on that, in the middle of the 2000s, around 2005, I put those questions to the then Prime Minister of New Zealand and then Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. So Helen Clark and Kevin Rudd put those questions to them both directly, relating to the concept of climate change refugee as a status and defined at the United Nations as such, and what countries like New Zealand and Australia may actually provide from the point of view of asylum. They basically looked at each other, and Rudd just basically hand gestured to Helen Clark and says, he's one of your people, you answer this, and she said that she felt our apparatus legally was able to address the needs irrespective of what the cause was. But that's how far away from, the issue had developed, and the policy positions, even regionally intergovernment ones, hadn't caught up to the threat. So is this a good thing, Paul? Is it best to park that kind of thing into its own silo, separate from perhaps the more traditional defence policy requirements that countries like New Zealand must have? Or is it okay to meld the two together?
I do think, I think we're going to have to meld the two. We'll still always retain a core of traditional perspectives and approaches to security. So we'll have a Navy, we'll have an Army, but I think humanitarian concerns will become increasingly national security issues. Let me give you an example of where this myopia can lead. Right now, part of the debate in the United States about immigration is they're seeing very large numbers of Haitians showing up on the southern border. Haitians, not Central Americans. The Haitians are taking this really long route to get to the American border. They're transiting via Chile, via Venezuela. That's caused political problems in Chile. Chile is a mixed indigenous people, white nation. Haitians are African. just say that isn't going too well. And so the Chileans are expelling Haitians in large numbers. They get to the American border, and the Republicans turn it into they're criminals, they're, the usual racist approach. That's not the issue at all. Haiti is a disaster. It's an ecological disaster. It is a place where climate change and traditional corruption and whatnot have all met in a big way. It is an unmitigated environmental disaster.
And earthquakes that, have destroyed the place. Yep.
Yeah, no, the place is destroyed. Now, and then on top of it, they had their prime minister or their president was assassinated by a bunch of Colombian mercenaries at the behest of one of his rivals. So both politically and socially, it's chaotic. The people who are fleeing at great risk to themselves are not criminals. They just want to live. A lot of these people are bringing their families over that long, long journey to find opportunity, and they see the United States as the land of opportunity. I would ask them to, to have a second thought on that. But nevertheless, that's what they're doing. Of course, smugglers are taking advantage of them, the whole shebang. But they're not criminals. They are environmental refugees. They, large part, there's no woodland. If you look at a satellite photo, that island has Haiti on the western side and the Dominican Republic on the eastern side. You can see a clear line of deforestation right down the middle of that island. And the left side of that is Haiti, the bare side, the barren side. And then the lush side is the Dominican Republic. This is a national security concern. It's translated from non-traditional into a clear and present. I wouldn't call Haitian families massed on the Rio Grande trying to get into Texas as a existential national security threat. But you can be sure the Republicans will for all the wrong reasons. And so we have to be aware that we now have to start, you said it well, overlapping traditional and non-traditional security perspectives into a more holistic approach that says, okay, conventional conflicts can flare up in places like the South China Sea. Okay, this is just going to be state on state arguing about territory. But there are these other concerns where people are fleeing because they don't have potable water. What do we do with them? If we feel they don't add value to our society. See, New Zealand should be welcoming everybody because we are labor poor. We don't have enough workers for the amount of jobs out there, but we privilege skilled labor. We don't want unskilled labor. We got plenty of that. And so we tend to discriminate in our immigration policy in favor of people who are relatively well educated. Well,
watch that space, because everything is pointing to the evidence of supply, housing supply getting cracking going, right? Particularly in 2022. I've got painters here at the moment, and they're saying they can't get anybody to pick up the paintbrush at the moment. They're just not there, and they're looking overseas for that. As soon as that border starts to open, New Zealand needs all sorts of people that are ready and able and keen to do work to get the place going again. So there's interesting things. Sorry, Paul, should we jump now to... just finish that. We'll jump to the pandemic impact of COVID-19 and variants on global security. We can touch that probably pretty quickly. Then we'll go to security, Afghanistan, AUKUS, autonomous weapons, cyber hackers, cyber attackers, and just perhaps define those and then make our projections for 2022 and beyond. So these are the things that have obviously been defining this 2021. So just finish up perhaps on this issue relating to defence and a morphing between the natural disasters, the natural threats, and human-made threats that are starting to preoccupy governments around the world.
Let me do this. I mentioned that there were two shadows being cast on global affairs. One was the dark shadow of authoritarianism, of which part of that was Trumpism, which I didn't get into specifically. But there is what you might call a ray of hope, or a golden shadow, a potentially golden shadow, and that is pandemic mitigation. Right now, we're dealing with a fourth wave. Things are still pretty grim in many places. But the hard fact is this: we're going to come out of the pandemic with a very different perspective on the world economy, on how government should respond, a revaluation perhaps of democratic governance. In other words, rather than see this in negative terms, I'm looking down the road and going, given all the things that made the pandemic worse, the structure of global capitalism, the corruption of democratic governance in some instances, we're going to have a revaluation on global scale and perhaps a reconfiguration of some of the basic foundations of modern society to include capitalism itself. And that may lead to more sustainability. It may lead to different perspectives. I've been told recently that New Zealand would like to introduce more indigenous-oriented forms of conflict resolution, supposedly based more on consensus building than on confrontation. I'm all for it.
Just on that point, it sounds similar to what Nanaia Mahuta, New Zealand's foreign minister, brought to the table, where a country or its ministers in bilateral arrangements would seek to find common ground as opposed to differences. Is that what we're talking about?
Right. I mean, years ago, I again was part of a team. There are two notions of security writ large: collective security, where you form alliances to deter common enemies, and then cooperative security, where you engage the erstwhile enemy and you build trust and confidence based on mutual concessions on the security front. I used to kid with my colleagues and say, it's the "I'll show you mine if you show me yours" approach to security, and that was about nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. If we can bring in more consensus-oriented approaches to international conflict resolution, I'm all for it. The question is, will people like the Chinese, the Russians, and even the Americans who slaughtered their own indigenous people and then have basically enslaved them ever since, will they even listen to the likes of Mahuta when they broach this subject? I hope so. I think there's a lot of room for this, but it remains to be seen. The larger point, of course, is that because we're coming out of this pandemic in a very different world than when we went into it in late 2019, and because some places will be shown to be successes, I think that New Zealand will be still held up as a model for the mitigation, even though there have been flaws and a very steep learning curve and resistance. But I think the contrast between successful mitigation strategies and unsuccessful strategies will actually, among other things, boil down to good governance. Governments that are responsive to their people, and those that are more elite-centric and the like. So I actually, out of this, I see this drifting in or leaching into perceptions of security. That military leaders, the security establishment in many countries, will begin to reevaluate those non-traditional concerns and give them more priority. And not just in cosmetic ways. For example, the U.S. Navy has reduced the acoustic signatures of its underwater testing in coastal waters around the United States because it harms cetaceans. That was driven by environmentalists, but they only do so in the coastal areas around the United States. Perhaps, and I tend to look at that as tokenism, even though it was good for the cetaceans who happen to inhabit those waters. If we start adopting security approaches that are like, can we come together and forge common approaches to, let's say, climate refugee flows? Can we use the military to engage in water projects that free up clean water for impoverished populations or populations that are now regularly besieged by drought? Those sort of things may actually constrain and maybe even reduce the areas of traditional conflict, where weapons are used, and expand the areas where more humanitarian operations, civil assistance missions, those sort of things can be used. Now,
it sounds a good thing to me. So would military like
good,
perhaps the New Zealand Defence Force or even the Australian Defence Force, would they be in on this? Would they buy in on?
Well, see, that's just it. I mean, I'm saying this because to me it's an unqualified good. But if you look at military commanders, if you look at the military-industrial complex around the world, not just in the United States, they're not going to want to borrow this. For the industrial complex, that will impinge on their profitability. And for military commanders with traditional mindsets, if you're going to give up certain advantages, for example, New Zealand's just come out and has joined in calls for a multinational treaty banning the use of artificial intelligence in lethal robotics.
And I'll just point in on this, those that have typecasted and put aside the New Zealand politician Phil Twyford and thinking that he's a spent force. That guy's been sitting around doing a lot of work in this particular space. Radio New Zealand, to its credit, gave some good reportage around that, and it may just be one of those things that the Ardern government has been looking for to represent on the global multilateral stage and obviously through the doors of the General Assembly at the United Nations. So this is an interesting thing. Why don't we just jump to this and look at this? Paul, you raised this very issue on when we looked at autonomous weapons about maybe a month and a half ago. And you said to me then and to our audience that you believed there needed to be global constraints on the advancement and the use of autonomous weapons. What we're talking about there is basically AI-driven weapons that can be controlled and all the decision-making made by artificial intelligence in a theatre of warfare that may be addressed or in the sights are human beings. Yeah. So where are we with this, and how elevated is the concern from the point of view of comparing to other major issues of threat to humankind, like chemical warfare, biological warfare, nuclear warfare in all of its forms?
Well, it's a serious conundrum on several levels. I mean, that 10 years ago, I put out a public call in here in New Zealand for us to unilaterally renounce the use of lethal drones when we eventually acquired them. New Zealand now has drones, non-lethal ones, I'll say that. But it got no purchase. Not a single political party, including the Greens, supported my call to come out and make what was essentially, to my mind, sort of like the non-nuclear stance. That we're going to, put our foot down and say, we will never use lethal drones. We'll use them for all other purposes. Got no purchase here in peaceful old New Zealand. Well, that's old hat stuff. Now the concern is this. You can program a drone, but you can program terrestrial robots, and I'll mention one in a second, to recognize threats. So just to be crude about it, recognize a human-like figure with a gun, an automatic weapon that is used by an enemy. Some enemies don't wear uniforms, so you might have them in various arrays. And then you send these machines out into the battlefield, and they kill. And they're ruthlessly efficient. Now, besides the fact that they may mistake a child with a stick for a small guy with an AK-47, although I'm told the technologies of recognition are supreme, and that will not happen. Where have we heard that before? But besides that, there is this problem. The duty of the military commander in the first instance is to protect his troops. If you can put machines into the battlefield rather than your troops, you're fulfilling that first duty. So military commanders are going to be very loath to unilaterally give up the opportunity to protect their troops, if nothing else, as a second strike. and put machines into battle first, because it may solve the issue. If machines fight each other, one machine prevails over the other, or 100 machines prevail over 100, then the outcome of that battle, and maybe eventually the war, will be decided.
I'll raise this part here too, Paul, that, it's no secret that under George W. Bush's administration, we saw the document come out that established that the United States believed it had the right to preemptive defence under these particular certain conditions. And it labelled, remember, the axis of evil nations, of which was detailed at that time. And you've got documents, and that's not exclusive to the United States. We would expect that other powers around the world would have similar things. Under certain conditions, we believe we have the right to preemptive defence, meaning to strike, a first strike capability. We believe we have that, and we will utilise that under these conditions. Now, if you program that into an AI kind of paradigm, where it's looking at these types of things that trip off in a basic sense an algorithm that goes through, and it thinks, all right, I've got the reasons here justified on the agreed documents of my programs, I have to act now. There you go. I'm spelling out a simple statement of fact of where countries believe they have the right and the purpose and the interest to first strike preemptive defence. And when you've got AI in the theatre and AI into the mix, where are the blurred lines? Those are my major concerns. So we come back to, how do you mitigate or even litigate the opportunities at a multilateral scale level to address these types of concerns, so they are open to where the dangers of these such threats in reality lie? To be able to identify, is that worry, that concern real?
Oh, it's very real. And I'll point out, you mentioned Bush and preemptive defense in the same sentence. This is one of the horrors of the Bush attack on Iraq. He said preemptive defense, but preemptive defense is you are about to be struck imminently by an enemy, so you preempt that strike that is already on its way. You try to get out in front of something that's already coming your way. Preventative defense is when you engage in regime change. The threat is not imminent. The threat is down the road, but you're just going to take away the enemy's capability now rather than have to engage him in 6 months or a year. Preventative defense is a very dubious concept in international law, because you can basically engage in preventative defense for whatever reason. You say, well, this guy's going to be powerful in 5 years, I might as well take him out. And Iraq posed no existential threat to the United States. They were trying to take Assad out because he was a pain in the rear. They thought they could get a Western-friendly country in order to confront Iran. And if he did have chemical or nuclear weapons, they could remove that, none of which, as it turns out, were found. So preemptive defense is a valid concept in international law, and Bush deliberately misused that phrase to engage in preventative defense against Iraq. Well,
yeah, and remember, just to underscore that fact, that in amongst those reasons that would justify a response from the United States was economic as well. That was tagged in. So I just wanted to add It underscores your point. Exactly.
The oil mob. Well,
and at the same time of pulling out of the International Criminal Court and other international legal bodies. So we know what we know. But getting back to this autonomous weaponry.
Right. I mean,
and the call by New Zealand is moving to call for negotiations relating at multilateral level of constraint and control over how they may be used. And people, maybe I suggest here that people relate to it in the same way that chemical warfare, chemical weapons and biological weapons have been pretty much globally put as much as you can into their box, yeah?
Okay, yes, but I fear that horse may have bolted because the great powers that have the capability to engage in artificial intelligence-driven lethal robots are going to be loath to get rid of them at the behest of smaller states that don't have that capability. It'll have to be, to return to a theme that you and I used several months ago, it'll have to be a microlateral or a mini-lateral agreement between the great powers that they will forego voluntarily the use of these machines. Now, that's where military scholars have to come in, because the philosophical premise behind this is war is not valid unless humans are at risk. That's why it's such a, such an enterprise, is that we put our sons and daughters at risk in order to prevail in some political contest. Bringing machines in takes the risk to humans out of it. And that's not fair. It's not a human enterprise anymore. So military scholars, Russian, Chinese, American, Greek, would have to get together and say, look, going back to the days of Thucydides, the point of war is to put your people in harm's way because you think something's so important that you must achieve it. And the idea is you won't do that. You won't risk them for frivolous things. Now, the United States history in the last 30 years will tell you that the U.S. leadership will risk its sons and daughters for frivolous things, not for existential threats. And that's very sad. But I think that if you get the great powers with this capability to sit down and say, let's put the humanity back into warfare. It sounds silly. I mean, but this is a philosophical discussion. It's not just about prevailing. Maybe we can move somewhere. I don't think New Zealand introducing resolutions in the General Assembly is going to get very far. They're going to get vetoed by the Security Council, and they're going to get vetoed by everybody except the temporary members. But let me show you how far this horse is bolted so we understand what we're up against. The U.S. Marines have a robotic dog. This dog, which is about the size of a Doberman and has sort of the look of a Doberman, was developed for close urban combat in the Middle East. Now let's be clear. In the Middle East, there is a cultural hatred of dogs. These are cultures that do not like dogs. And so the psychologists who came up with using working dogs to torture people in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq came up with the idea that you produce a dog, a mechanical dog, for close quarter fighting, and you let it loose on a sniper or some, entrenched position in a place like Ramallah. The other guys are going to run because the dog is fearsome. Now, add to that dog artificial intelligence and a big set of jaws with ferocious teeth and program it to attack and kill anything it finds around the corner.
So you've got psyops as well. Yeah,
it's all embedded in these machines. The U.S. Armed Forces are very, very pleased with themselves because they can spare their soldiers the clearing of houses in contested space because they can use these machines to that effect. Now, they may say, yeah, but, we're using the dog because that'll make these guys run. We could have used, a chicken, or an eagle, and they wouldn't run, so then they'd have to be dealt to. And so, we're just being sensitive to the fact that this happens to be a cultural idiom we can exploit. But when you add to it artificial intelligence that programs this machine, which now has a lethal set of choppers up in the front of it, to go sick on people and kill them, because it will not stop until they're dead. That moves beyond the laws of war. One of the things about the laws of war is if your enemy is down and is clearly no threat, you stop shooting them, right? Then you render assistance. That's part of the laws of war. Yeah. I know many instances.
Even though it was abused in Afghanistan on many occasions.
It's abused, but the point is, if there's a will,
it exists.
I know people in the U.S. military who have been court-martialed because they shot a fallen enemy when he tried to get up after the squad passed him by. You're supposed to check him for weapons. You're supposed to ascertain that he's not in the fight anymore. And in one specific instance, person I knew was leading a squad. They all walked past what they thought was a mortally wounded enemy, and the guy sat up. And he sat up with a grenade in his hand, and so he was shot dead. The commander of that squad was court-martialed because it was his responsibility to ascertain that the enemy did not pose a threat, and that by shooting him after the fact, that was a violation of war. Now, the wars of the 2000s and 2010 have led to a serious erosion of adherence to the laws of war by the U.S. military, among others. I mean, we've got our own problems here. The Australians have their problems. My point is this: if you start introducing these lethal machines in the ways I've just described to you, you're taking the laws of the war out of the picture, because these machines are acting autonomously. You program them, and out they go. It's not like a human is guiding them.
Yeah, and to the audience on that point, I would encourage them to Google, for example, Palantir, artificial intelligence in satellite weaponry, for example. And what it's doing there is offering a commercial expertise to, you know, obviously United States government and other friendly allies, of being able to adjust from satellite with AI driven in theatres of conflict. And we touched on that in previous episode, and I'd stress that the audience actually looks into this, that all of the ethics, the operative elements of it, and actions of conduct, the legal elements of it. This is a discussion that is lagging well behind the advancement in technologies and capabilities. And it's an area where in 2022, perhaps, one would hope, Paul, as we look forward to the next year, that these types of discussions do take place at a broader global forum, perhaps, whichever one that may be appropriate for such things. Paul, let's just touch on that 2022. What do you believe are some of the most dominating themes that we can expect to see and be confronted with as we look just over the horizon to this new year coming?
Well, first and foremost, it's going to be a political watershed year, because there's a number of elections throughout the world, particularly amongst what's left of the democratic world, but important countries. Brazil will have a presidential and congressional elections that will be absolutely decisive in determining its future. My adopted country, Argentina, will have presidential and congressional elections. The United States will have its midterms. Indonesia will have a presidential election. That will determine the immediate future. For example, if the Republicans win back Congress in 2022, and there's a distinct possibility they will, then, as we spoke about last week, Donald Trump will be back in office in 2024, and God help us all if that happens. So right there, we will see a test of democracy, you know, in keeping with the theme that I mentioned earlier in the show. You know, I don't know which way this thing is going to swing. I've got a bad feeling that it's going to confirm the authoritarian trend, and we're going to see more national populists get elected. And then we're in for 25 years of authoritarianism around the world, and that augurs poorly for conflict, because authoritarians are prone to conflict. That's how they come into power, by exploiting divisions. And what is the first remedy of an authoritarian when confronted by domestic failure or unrest? Is to stage diversions and pick fights with people abroad. Easy to scapegoat, exploit traditional grievances, you know, all that sort of toolbox will be used, and increasingly, if the trend is to confirm authoritarianism on a political level. On the other hand, if pandemic mitigation efforts succeed and a balance between economic opportunity is struck, because the anti-vax crowd that talks about freedoms, I ignore them because it's either ignorance or partisanship that is talking. But capitalists are really chafing under pandemic restrictions. And so if we can open that up and show that the worst is behind us, then that can reaffirm that you can, in fact, come out at the other end of the tunnel under democratic leadership. And so, the pandemic mitigation strategies between now and when election season starts in May and June in the Northern Hemisphere will be absolutely important. And then with regards to warfare itself, just to touch on the last thing, there's two things going on here that show you that there's competition within the military industrial establishments of the great powers that are pushing the frontiers in artificial intelligence. And it works this way. On the one hand, you have the belief, I would subscribe to this belief in my strategic thinking, that if you can undermine the enemy from within with disinformation campaigns, influence operations, that sort of thing, if you can weaken him, then you don't have to fight him in a conventional war. You will be able to bend him because his own people no longer believe in the rivalry as traditionally described. So this is what I would call the subversive approach to strategic competition. You worm into the enemy. And the Russians and Chinese are way out in front, but they're not the only ones. I mean, there's a number of countries and non-state actors, as we've discussed, that are in the process of doing this. That, to me, is the better way to pursue what is now known as hybrid warfare. The other one is the artificial intelligence route. You dispense with the philosophical arguments against using machines instead of humans in warfare. You go for it. You say, the purpose is to win. Forget this whole human beings have to involve. Let's get the machines in there, have them fight it out, and whichever machine wins, to the victor goes the spoils, and that includes space. Let's not limit ourselves to the terrestrial Earth or the maritime Earth. Let's go for it. But let's let the machines fight it out. There could be an overlap between the subversive campaign and the robotic campaign, for lack of a better phrase. But those are the two trends in military technology affairs. And I hope they don't overlap, but certainly given the prevalence of algorithms in everyday life, I fear that they are involved. But if they are, then let's hope they push towards the more subtle sabotage ways of war than unleashing machines on conventional and unconventional battlefields throughout the globe.
Yeah, well, that's a picture we should pick up. And that's the end of our series 2, Paul. It's the second year we've been doing a view from afar in this context, in this format, and we are getting a sense of momentum to it, and certainly some great feedback that has come back from not only our audience but also those that are able to cite and use some of the material that we have discussed and debated on this program. So it's an effort, I think, that is speaking for us both as well and truly worthwhile. In 2022, we will be back with season 3, and one would expect that after a good break, we'll have some great meaty issues to be able to bring to the table, and perhaps, like we have in series 2, bring some guests in on the occasion to debate their specialisations, and that would be an exciting trend too. So thank you from behalf of us both, Paul. I'll just pass you over to Paul.
Just 30 seconds. I just wanted to wish all of the listenership a very happy holidays, and hopefully we can reconvene. And one note on the listenership. I know that some of the discussions that Selwyn and I have can get rather complicated, and that sometimes I in particular use academic jargon and what have you. So I am very thankful there are the people who have persisted and who have hung in there in spite of some of the esoteric talk, because these are complicated issues. And Selwyn and I, we have a friendship in which we talk about this stuff a lot off camera, and outside of the podcast. In fact, I think that's part of the reason for the podcast was ongoing conversations. But we're two guys who are like political creatures. So, we've been doing this for a while. I thought as we were coming into the show today that with a lay audience, even though they're politically oriented, some of this stuff can get pretty dense. And so, my thanks to you for hanging in, and hopefully we'll see most of you next year, should we all still be around.
Yeah, how's that? We've just got one of the audience members here, Andrew Lim, who's saying, and I know Andrew is a regular listener, not so much a regular commentator, but a regular listener, and we've always appreciated knowing you were there, Andrew. And he says, thanks for the effort and wish you all the best for the summer holidays. So, how
Cheers,
good
Andrew.
is that? That's seriously cool. Thank you for that. Well, until next year, I hope you're all safe and take safe journeys in the holiday season, and I hope whichever way you celebrate the end of the year and in this particular time of the year, that it's a good one. And we've got our challenges. Let's try and make the most of them. Until we see you again, smooth sailing, and we'll see you on the other side in 2022. Until then, bye, take care.